Imagine yourself walking through the streets of Jerusalem, seeing the garden tomb, praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, feeling the excitement of the crowd in the old city. Imagine touching the western wall as you lift your voice in prayer. You can see Jerusalem, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, and much more. Shalom, I am Omer Eshel, CEO of the Bible Comes to Life Travel and Education Center. Being a fourth-generation Israeli and living my life in Israel, I know the impact that this Holy Land has on people from all walks of life. There is just something about seeing the places that we read in the Bible day in and day out. Places where Jesus spent his childhood, where he taught, preached, and from where he called his disciples. We have planned your itinerary very carefully to offer you the absolute best educational tour. You will visit Megiddo and overlook the Valley of Armageddon. We will analyze the battle where David slew Goliath from above the battlefield itself. We will visit Magdala, home of Mary of Magdalene, and we will see the temple where Jesus would have preached. Visiting the city of David and the temple steps and walking through the underground rabbinical tunnels will give you a new perspective as you watch the Bible comes to life before your very eyes. From the mountain plateau of Masada, the last Jewish stronghold which was destroyed in the year 73 AD, you will overlook the lowest place on earth, the Dead Sea. You'll have time to float in this amazing and unique body of water. This 10-day tour gives you an incredible overview of the Holy Land. All costs are included in deluxe hotels, entrances to all sites, breakfast and dinners daily, transportation on a luxury bus, specially trained guides, tips, and so much more. A visit to the Holy Land of Israel is a journey that many people dream of experiencing at some point in their lives. It is the time.
Hey guys, wanted to take a quick minute before the podcast starts to let you know a little bit about our special guest and our sponsor for this week. We're joined by Omer Eshel, who is the CEO of The Bible Comes to Life, Israel's premier Bible study guided tour. They are a travel ministry and education center located in the Holy Land. They were founded in 2017 by former Israeli consul Omer Eshel, and TBCTL is quickly becoming one of the largest and most sought-after tourism companies in Israel. They offer customizable itineraries to churches and groups with the main objective of revealing the truth of the Bible through the lens of archaeological discovery in Israel. For more information about them, you can visit tbctl.com, or if you would like more information about future tours that we may be taking, get a little bit more information from us about what we're doing and how we're working directly with TBCTL, you can always text the code HOLYLAND to 94000. That's HOLYLAND to 94,000. You're listening to Heart of the Father, a podcast from Pastor Eugene Weldon. For more information about our ministry and how you can get involved, text the code Kingdom Life to 94000. That's Kingdom Life to 94,000. Welcome back to Heart of the Father podcast. We are excited to have our very first guest with us today. Welcome, Omer Eshel. He is our friend from Israel. He's our ministry partner. He is the CEO of The Bible Comes to Life. Welcome, my friend.
Shalom. Thank you for having me here.
Yes, sir. We're very happy to have you. The reason we started this podcast was to share the heart of the Father. And one of the things that has really been on Dad's heart this year is a reestablishment of the feast and returning to the feast of the Lord. So today, the podcast is going to be all about the feasts. And so, Dad, did you have anything specific you wanted to add?
No, I mean, this year, the word for this year was reality. Okay, and so we want to walk in truth. John 4:23 says, those who worship God must worship in spirit and in truth. And today is that day that we're supposed to do that. So if we're going to worship in spirit and truth, then we need to learn the truth of God's word. And as we go back to some of the words that God has given me for the last 3 years, reestablish was one of those words. And what I believe that God was saying is that we need to reestablish the feast. And as we look at the feast, Of course, you already said that it's in Leviticus 23, and as you start going through the feast, they were supposed to be perpetual feast. It was something that was to be continual, and they were called the Lord's feast. They weren't called the Christians' feast. It wasn't called the Jews' feast. It was called the Lord's feast. And so, our understanding that there was three main feasts, that they had to return to Jerusalem on those three feasts. The Feast of Pentecost, Passover, and Tabernacles. And so what we want you to do is we want you to share the history of all the feasts and why they were so important and why they're important to us today. For me, just in a simple way of thinking, it was all about acknowledging God, that he was the King of Kings and that he was a sovereign God and that we were to honor him in all things. And the Jews were taught, Israel were taught they taught their children to recognize God in everything. I think we get away from it here in the States. A lot of times we get away from acknowledging God in everything and in every area. And so that's why we wanted you to teach on the feast, going to Israel and sitting with you in your home and watching what you do with your daughters.
Right.
It's unbelievable that your daughters know more about the Bible than we do, because you've actually taken them to the places in Israel where it all took place. Your daddy taught you. You in turn have taught your children. And we've gotten away from that here in the States. We haven't trained up our children. He gives us a promise: if we'll train up our children in the paths of righteousness, when they grow old, they won't depart from it. Mm-hmm. But I think that we failed so much in that in the church in the United States. And that's something I feel like that God is speaking now. If we're going to walk in reality, if we're going to walk in truth, then we've got to really return to God. And in Israel, there was a continual returning to God. They may have walked away and done things, but a lot of times I saw every 400 years they would return to God. Mm-hmm. And they would always rededicate the temple. They'd always re-cleanse the temple. And they'd always reestablish the feast. And they would always return to those. And I think that that's where we're at in the church age here today in the United States. That we've got to return to God. We've got to re-cleanse the temple, which represents each and every one of us.
Right.
And then we've got to be willing to reestablish the feast of the Lord. We've got to reestablish his word. And those are the things, Omer, why it's been such a blessing to get to know you, to watch how it's done. Because we get to see it in real time when we're there in Israel with you. We get to see how you take them to those places, and we get to see the reality of your children honoring God in everything.
I think that one of the things that is important for us, and I think that the reason that you're looking at turning back to God is today people seem to forget that God has his hands on everything. Especially now when looking at COVID, for example. I'm going to give you something that comes from Israel, the way I feel it. Man in its vanity and arrogance says, I will beat COVID.
I'm going to shut it down.
I'm going to shut it down.
We're going to do it.
Yeah, I'm going to do it. I'm going to, not God. I will do it. No, I'm going to make those vaccinations. Yeah. I'm going to, yeah. Mm-hmm. And you know what? I'm vaccinated like everybody in Israel. We have to.
Yeah. Now, wills that work?
Exactly. And when you look at it now, all of my friends have COVID and they're vaccinated.
Yep.
So this is, there's a really good saying here that says, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans.
Right. Tell him your plans. Yeah.
It's the same thing. Now, Leviticus, and I think that what you're doing is absolutely correct. Leviticus 23, God gave an exact manifest of how to do it.
How to do it, yeah.
It's not that it's not we are guessing what kind of variant we're going to have in COVID, so we are guessing what kind of booster we need to give. No. This is like God is saying, guess how you should honor me. This is what you should do. So I think that the fact that the church is coming back, you are coming back to the actual manual of God.
Right.
That's the way to do it.
The original intent.
Exactly, because God is not here for interpretation. It's not for us to interpret what He wants. He tells you, and we had a conversation about the book of Zechariah that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It says what God's like and dislike. It's
very plainly.
very plainly black and white. Well, black and brown. And it's, but
yeah.
When you look at the feasts, there are 7 feasts. Well, actually, there's a little bit more, but in book of Leviticus 23, it speaks about 7 feasts. We celebrate 8 because the Feast of Dedication is another feast mentioned in the Bible. Actually, that's when Jesus came to the temple at the age of 4, and that's again when he came to debate with the rabbis.
Yes.
That was the Feast of Dedication. But the 3 main ones are extremely important. And just to share this with our audience, if you try to find a hotel room in those what we call regalim is the pilgrimages, those 3 big feasts, you won't be able to get any hotel room. And actually, that's what happened in the Bible as well. When Jesus came down with his disciples, if you remember the room of the Last Supper, it was a small attic because there was no room. There was no hotel. Same thing when Joseph went down with Mary. They went down during the feast. Yeah. That's why we had a completely different conversation about the actual birthday of Jesus that was not on December 24. Definitely not. Mm-hmm. It was probably the Feast of Tabernacle.
Yeah.
Probably. If you calculate according to John, when John jumps in the womb of Elizabeth, but this is for a different podcast. The thing is, though, that they kept the feast, they then and we today.
One of the things when we were in Israel, and we were one of our first trips, you took us to Shiloh. Okay, mm-hmm. You call it Shiloh, but we called it Shiloh.
Uh-huh.
All right, then you took us to Shiloh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you took us out, and we stood on the mountain, and we looked out over the mountainside, and all over the mountainside you could see clay pottery.
Yeah,
you could see and you said that when they would make their pilgrimage, they would carry their clay pots in there, and when they finished, they would just bust the clay pots instead of having to carry them all with them. And so the whole mountain is covered, and you can just see that they continued to come here year after year, and how important it was to them. That's amazing that it's still laying on top of that mountain.
If you're going to dig on the slope of the mountain that doesn't look over the tabernacle, you'll find nothing. Nothing. You go over the ridge to the place that face the tabernacle, you're going to find more clay pots and rocks.
It's everywhere. Yes, it was all over the place. And that showed us how important it was to them that they would make those pilgrimages, that they would come back there every year.
3 times.
3 times.
3 times a year, yeah.
Yeah, we can't hardly give up our ball games or our kids' programs or anything else to do what God says to do.
And the beautiful thing about those feasts, when you look at them, it's interesting to see how the calendar actually changed in the Bible, because today in Israel we'll celebrate the New Year, which is one of the feasts, but that's in the Bible will be the 10th month, not the first month, because the first month in the Bible is the month of Nisan, not Tishrei. Why is that? And this is something that I think it's beautiful. When the first calendar was introduced to the Hebrews, it wasn't Jews back then; it was Hebrews. It was after the receiving of the Bible at Mount Sinai, which back then the Jews were nomads in the desert. So agricultural meant nothing. They were shepherds.
Right.
So it really doesn't, there's no cycle of seeds. It doesn't really matter to them. When they got into Israel and when they reclaimed the land, they changed that calendar from the desert calendar to a national calendar, which we use until today. So the cycle of the seeds goes along with the seasons. But the beautiful thing about when you look at those 3 main pilgrimage, if you look at the Feast of Tabernacle, that speaks about the Exodus of Egypt. Speaks about the Exodus of Egypt and the first fruit, that you harvest the fruit and you give it to God. On Passover is the Feast of Spring and rejuvenation. This is actually, I think, a good reason why Jesus resurrected after Passover. It's to reborn again. And the third one will be after the harvesting of the wheat, which is the wheat is the cornerstone of nutrition. This is something I once read something really interesting. It says money can satisfy you to a point, but bread will never, because you cannot eat money. You can eat bread. Bread is the essence of life. And the beautiful thing about it, God is saying in every one of those feasts, he says, you need to bring to me, gift me the first harvest. which for a lot of people it's a big deal. You toil the land, you protected it, you water it, but the first fruit is yield to God.
It's his.
Always.
It is
Always. First fruits always his.
always. And that brings me back to what we said about COVID. This is to bring down the arrogance and the vanity of man. The fact that you succeeded with your harvest, it's not because of you. It's because God blessed you.
Yeah.
So you need to give him back.
Well, in one of our discussions in Israel, one of our panel discussions, I made a comment in it that if there was only one sin, it would be pride. But because we say that we don't need God. We don't believe that he's the sovereign God.
Right.
So anything we do in our own strengths, abilities, talents, without him, it's very evident.
It's something that is very, very strong and embedded into the Jewish culture, that understanding of, it's called payment of the firstborn.
Yeah.
Payment of the firstborn, not necessarily by money. You go and you give honor to God.
And it's all about the honor. It's all about honor.
It's all about honor.
That's it. It's all about honor. Yeah.
And I think, what I was going to say is I think that's the whole point of even discussing the feast, because I know for a lot of Christians, it's a little bit out there because it's not what's been taught in traditional evangelical churches. There's some, I think, that have really tried to return to the feast, but the main focus is really to understand that it is to honor the Lord. And I think that's
a lot of the way I think, Court, that the church looks at it in the culture we're in today, is they look at it like, well, you're going under the law. That's back under the law. This has nothing to do with the law. It has to do with honoring God.
right.
We're told in Romans that we're to give honor to whom honor is due. Well, ultimately,
We have
all
to honor
honor
God.
goes to God, period. And it's a reflection in our society, how we honor one another. When we don't honor God, then we're not going to honor one another.
Right.
When we don't ultimately understand. He addresses it in James when he talks about the tongue. With your tongue, you honor God, but in the same mouth, you curse man,
Right.
which he created in his similitude. And so that's one of the things this is about is honoring and giving honor to him. It's not about being legalistic. It's
Right.
not about going under the rules and regulations of the law. It's about understanding that he said, these are my feasts. Recognize in our country today, we don't want to remember our history.
Yeah.
And when you don't remember your history,
You will repeat it.
you're going to repeat it.
Yeah.
Well, Israel, they remember their history.
Yeah.
They have the hall of history.
Yeah.
We have the hall of faith that tells about these guys. We've got to go back to some of these things.
One of the things that I was in shock when I lived in Chicago is that in the U.S. there's something that is called Memorial Day shopping, or Memorial Day sales.
Yeah.
You shop to remember
You
those.
shop to remember the fallen. I mean, this is
It's a commercialization of the world, honestly.
Well, when it's Black Friday,
right.
It's the day after
Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving.
Yeah, we're giving thanks and for our country and thanks for
And now go in
and now
debt.
let's go and,
That's
go
right.
and spend money.
When you read, I want to read this for folks here in Hebrew, just to understand how simple it is. It says here, וידבר אדוני אל משה לאמור, דבר בני ישראל ואמרת להם, מועדי אדוני אשר תקראו אותם. And God had spoken to Moses and said, speak to the children of Israel and tell them, these are the feasts of the Lord, which you will read into them and name them, and you will read my scriptures. You can't really get more easy than that. This is God says to Moses, these are the feasts, this is we're going to read my scriptures, and that's it.
That's it.
I mean, I wish life was that easy.
It's pretty plain.
It's just like you mentioned Zechariah 8 a few minutes ago. When they read that in the cave, in the Qumran caves, 8:16 and 17, it says, stop lying to one another.
Is that the thing I don't like?
Then he says, I want you to bring truth, justice, and peace into your gates, into your arena and influence. And by the way, stop lying to one another because I hate lying.
Right.
That is, how much plainer can you get?
The beautiful thing about this, and this is something that I think need to be funneled down to generation after generation. If we would have sat down 3,000 years ago, not in a podcast with this nice microphone that we have, I bet there were people who said, oh, we are very much advanced. Look at this. We just conquered the land. We did it. We're about to build our temple. We defeated the Jebusite. We. And then you move away from God. And then God is keep on telling you, you have to do what I tell you because otherwise there are going to be consequences. Mm-hmm. And those arrogant people say, nah, it's not God, it's us. Boom, he brings down the Babylonians and there go the temple. His house is being destroyed by him.
When Joshua entered the promised land.
Exactly.
The greatest fortified city in the land was conquered by doing it God's way.
Exactly, guys.
Walking around, not saying anything, and then all of a sudden we decide, hey, there's that little peon town over there, AI. We can go over there and we can just take it over ourselves. When Joshua's laying on the ground crying, why, God, why? He says, pull up your big boy britches and get up. You didn't seek me, right? You went over there in your own strengths and look what happened.
Every time that we did not consult God, this is what happens. Every single time. Look at Ahab. Ahab had such a huge and strong army. He did not consult with God. He died from an arrow that was not even intended to shoot.
Intended to him, yeah.
Exactly right. Every time we do not consult God, that's what happened. And it's because of our own vanity. It's because men, not just anybody, from the Tower of Babylon all the way down. You know what? From Adam and Eve, when they lied to God.
Yep.
It's embedded in who we are. Yep. But the thing is, when you remember the feast of the Lord, when you surrender that first offering that you have, that you toiled so much, that first offering is the food of your children. But when you understand that it's more important to honor our Father in heaven, that he will protect us, because that's what he says, mm-hmm. That is a big deal. Imagine here you go to someone who just earned his first salary and you tell them, well, okay, 10% of your first salary, or even more than that, goes to God with no questions asked. And for a lot of people, it will be a very difficult mentality to do this because they're going to have doubts. They're going to say, how do I know it really goes to God? But the thing is, this is something I want to again, this is the way I read it, the way I see it. If someone is giving from his heart, God will look to his heart.
Correct. It's always a heart issue.
It's always a heart issue. When Samuel went to crown the next king of Israel after Saul, he went to Abinadab. He didn't go to David. And God was actually laughing at him. He said, man sees to the eye, God sees the soul. Right. And this is what it's all about. Yeah, it's not enough for us to remember the feast. We need to honor God in our heart.
It's always a heart issue.
Always a heart issue.
Always a heart issue. Yes.
So now that we've established it's a heart issue and it's obviously a way that we honor the Lord, let's talk about the three major ones and what makes them different from each other and what kind of traditionally would happen. So which one would you want to start with?
Let's start biblically. Biblically would be
that.
Yeah. Biblically, the first feast will be Feast of Passover.
Okay.
We're talking just about the three big ones.
Yes.
So biblically, it will be the Feast of Passover. Now, there's a very good reason why it's the first holiday. It's the first. It's the Exodus New Year.
Yes.
Why? Because this is the month that God took us out of Egypt.
Yes, correct.
And in the book of Exodus, it says God Himself took us out of Egypt. Not an angel, not a messenger. God Himself took us out of Egypt.
Well, and even whenever they did enter the Promised Land, that was what they were known by. They were known as the people who God brought them out of Egypt, and they didn't want to be taken over in the way that God destroyed the Egyptians.
Exactly right. So the first feast will be the Feast of Passover. We call it Pesach. Passover meaning passed over, when He passed over the house of the Israelites in the plague, in the last plague.
Yes.
The idea of the Passover is basically a reenactment. It really is. It's a reenactment of the eve of the Exodus of Egypt. So in that, it's the most important holiday in the Jewish calendar. Families sit together. There's a big, huge table with, it's a long, big meal. And you read the story of the Exodus from the time that the Israelites went down with the family of Jacob, down to, Joseph, down to Egypt, all the way out until the entry into the Promised Land. So we read about those 400 years. We read about the cities that Joseph built. We read about, and the idea is, this is what I love about Passover, the father needs to teach his children. And there's a book called Haggadah. That's the book that we read. Unlike Agada with an A, this is Haggadah with an H. Agada is a fairy tale. Haggadah is teaching.
Okay.
So, and it clearly says, and you will tell your children in that day the story of Exodus. And it is a command for the father of the house to teach his children. And later on that will continue. Okay? And it says in Hebrew, "V'higadeta lebilcha bayom hahu," and you will tell your children. So the idea is that the father, who is the role model of the family, teaches his sons and his daughters to be humble before God. Because God is the one who gave us all this, not the head of the family. What we do also, we do not eat unleavened bread. So you don't have any yeast during that because of the story of Exodus. If you remember, the Israelites had to haste out of Egypt.
Yes.
And they did not have enough time for the dough to rise. Exactly. So we do this, and then you have several items on the Seder plate representing the story. Now, why do we have those items? It's a family event. So in a family event, little kids need visuals to understand what you're talking about. Okay. If you're going to read it just as is, most kids are going to be bored after 5 minutes. So it's a reenactment, and the kids are a big part of it. So for example, we have a hard-boiled egg as one of the symbols. Why? Because God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So when the kid is eating that egg, we explain what it means. We have a very bitter herb that we need to eat. Why? Because the life of the Israelites were bitter under the Egyptians.
Right.
There is a candy that is called haroset. It's a kind of a mash made out of nuts and apples and cinnamon. It's actually very, very, very good.
Okay.
The idea of it is to represent the tin that the Israelites toiled to build the cities in Egypt under slavery. So everything has a meaning, and everything has an example for kids to understand. It's a very, very children-oriented holiday, very much so.
Which is great because I think it's if it's as a teaching mechanism, those things stick with you as a child. That helps you recognize biblically what these things represent.
Right. So this is the Feast of Passover. The next one in line will be my favorite feast, and that's the Feast of Shavuot, Pentecost. And the idea, it's the Feast of Omer. I'm named after that holiday. The main idea is that back then you didn't have accurate calendars. So basically what God says, he said, okay, you're going to count 49 days from the end of Passover, and that's the time that you know that the Omer, the wheat, is ripe to be harvested. So we have 49 days, and that's why it's called Pentecost. 7 weeks. We have 49 days of counting of the Omer, and then on Shavuot, it's a major, major, major holiday of basically there are two main events that happen there. One is the receiving of the Torah from Mount Sinai, happened on Pentecost.
On Pentecost, yes.
Which is the same as the descending of the Holy Spirit in Acts 2:3. It's the same. It's a prefiguration of it. That's one event. The second event is that you celebrate the harvest, and it's a very agricultural holiday, which have two main traditions. One, you study the Bible the whole night. It's called the Kiddush Leil Shavuot, meaning the signifying of the eve of Shavuot, the night of Shavuot, that you study the Bible the whole night. You have to stay up and read with your family and your friends and debate. That's what you do. It's Tikkun Leil Shavuot. It's one of the biggest events in Judaism. And the second one is celebrating the harvest. So you showing the fruits of the firstborn. You present that in front of the community. You have the first wheat, you have the first cows, you have the first children, by the way. It's a beautiful event that, the community gathers together, and then the mothers come in with the babies that were born that year and show them to the community. It's beautiful. It is the nicest holiday. So that's Shavuot. And the third one will be Tabernacle.
Yes.
We call it Sukkot. Sukkot is basically to remind us two things. One is the exodus of Egypt. When the Israelites were wandering in the desert, they lived in little huts.
Yep, little tents.
And we need to build those tents, again, together with the family. You don't buy a tent. You don't go to Walmart and buy a tent. You need to do it together with your children. It's a biblical command. You have to build it with your children, and then you have to dine inside. And there's a beautiful tradition that you have to bring guests coming over. And this is to commemorate the three angels that came to Abraham.
Yep.
So that's because that's the birth of Isaac. So that's during that feast. And this is one of my favorite. When you're inside, you have to see the sky. You have to see the stars. Why? To remind us who is above us. Mm. It's the fact that you're sitting here in bounty and you have guests and everything. It's very easy to slip aside and say it's because of me and because of my wealth and because of what I did. Right. But the idea is no, there are stars above you. God is looking down upon you. If you do not see the stars, it's a non-kosher tabernacle. You have to see the stars.
You have to see them. And I've seen some of the booths, and some of them are actually really pretty, the way that they decorate and all of that. It's really interesting.
It's a fun holiday. And the other thing that we do over there, on the 8th day of Sukkot, we celebrate the finishing of the reading of the Bible. Because in Judaism, every week you read a different portion of the Bible, and it's a cycle. And you finish it on the 8th day, which is, by the way, one of the feasts. That's the 8th day. 8th day. It's one of the feasts of the Lord. The 8th day is connected to Feast of Sukkot, Feast of Tabernacle, and we celebrate that. It's a big event. Mm-hmm. You celebrate that with dancing and candies and everything. And then the following day you start again reading the Bible.
Yeah. And so with that, how do you recommend people take a step one, I would say?
And that's what last year, we did. So we did the Feast of Tabernacles. We celebrated it. And I felt like this year we'd probably recognize all three of the main feasts, that we would look to them and get together, and do those.
Right.
It's a beginning. It's something that we can begin to teach and begin to start.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things we're planning on doing this year, to break down each one again. So Passover, I think, is probably one of the most significant ones.
Yeah.
Obviously, because of what it represents, because of what God did for them. And in a lot of ways, it started an entirely new generation of Hebrews.
Of course, yeah.
And so because of that, with the way that Pentecost follows, and then you end the year, because when does Rosh Hashanah fall between Pentecost and... I'm trying to think timeline-wise when these happen in the year.
Timeline, Rosh Hashanah is actually after. Rosh Hashanah is right before the Feast of Tabernacle.
Okay.
But Rosh Hashanah is not a desert calendar. It's an Israelite calendar. That's when they change the order of the month when they arrive into Israel. Biblically, the first month is the month of Nisan. That's the Feast of Passover. That's the first month.
Gotcha.
One of the interesting things that I saw in 2020 is that we had our first real Passover in the United States, because COVID shut things down, and everybody shut down their churches the 1st of April. And then we had that was the first real Passover that we experienced. And everybody began to search, end times. They began to search Passover. They began to, Google all those things, because it was something that actually began to take place.
Mm-hmm. The Feast of Passover, I think this is the next feast that's coming upon us.
Mm-hmm.
I think that even if you're not going to do it even together in the church, if you're going to stay at home and do it with your family, try even just to sit down for one night. I'm going to share this with our listeners. For one night, sit down, ask your children what part of the Bible they would like to read about. You can definitely do about the Exodus, but you can also speak about the resurrection, because that's connected completely to Passover. And study that together with your children.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the way you study that with your children, you ask them questions again and again and again. Don't dictate, because if you dictate, children will not understand.
They tune out too.
Exactly. So, by the way, this is the way that Jesus taught. He always asked questions, always. So when you sit down with your family, you take out the story of the Exodus and you explain that to your children as the Bible commands us.
Mm.
You explain that to your children. And even if they don't have a question, you should, in a way, plant the question. So they will receive that and they will ask it.
Ask it, sure.
And only that way, really, that's when they really sharpen their minds. And you'll see after that, give it 3-4 days for it to funnel. After that, you'll be amazed how your children read scriptures.
It's awesome. Well, and I think my big takeaway from this, in speaking about learning about the feast and kind of taking baby steps into honoring the Lord through them, I think it's obviously recognizing that it's biblically what we should do, that we should honor the Lord through these things. And then step two is treat it like a child. Come at it with the faith of a child, with the curiosity of a child. Instead of, like Dad, you had mentioned, some people had thought it was returning to legalism, but truthfully, it's just returning to God's original intent for his people, because we as Christians are grafted in. We believe the same Bible, we believe in the same God as the Hebrew God. It's all one family. It's just a recognition that, okay, God, we honor that these are your feast days, that these are important to you. And then I think our prayer has to be, help me receive it like a child would. Help me receive what this new phase in my walk with you, if you want to put it that way, what does that look like? And I love that you mentioned the different traditions and things that are in place are to help teach children. And I think that's a really interesting thing that I didn't realize how involved children actually were in the process. But I think that actually helps us to really think of the feasts in a childlike way of curiosity. Why should I do this? What does this look like? And it's okay to ask questions. I think that's one of the big things that I've learned in my friendship with you and understanding the Bible a little more, understanding Judaism a little more. It's okay to ask questions, because I think a lot of Christians feel like, oh, I shouldn't ask anything. And it's the dialogue and the instruction and being able to be curious about the Lord. It is childlike, and it's that childlike faith that Jesus calls us to.
One of the things that I love in the New Testament, John, John was the one who received the revelation. John was a child in the family of Jesus. He called himself the beloved one. Yes, okay. But John, think about it. Jesus, one of his disciples, was a child. And when you think about it today, it seems like, what do you mean was a child? I mean, you teach adults.
Adults, right.
You don't. You teach children from a very young age.
Train a child up in the way that he should go, and he won't depart from it when he's older. Yep.
Exactly right. And if you wanted to say, oh, this is just legislation or just the laws. Well, Jesus followed each and every one of those.
Yep.
And just as an example, what was he doing in Jerusalem before his crucifixion?
He was there for the Pentecost.
For
Passover, yes,
right.
yes. Passover.
He was there for Passover because that's what God says to do.
He commanded.
50 days later, the disciples come back because that's what God commanded. Mm-hmm. So this is showing it's not a Jewish thing. It is not a Christian thing.
It's a God thing.
It's a God thing.
Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. If you'd like to support our ministry financially and help us keep making content just like this, text the code Kingdom Life to 94000. That's Kingdom Life to 94,000. Have you ever wanted to take a piece of the Holy Land home with you? Now's your chance. Artza is a quarterly subscription box that follows the footsteps of Jesus and the Bible while supporting the people of Israel. Each box contains 9 products from local artisans in the Holy Land. It also includes information about different regions in Israel, recipes, and scriptures that bring the Bible to life. They deliver it right to your doorstep, and it is the perfect gift idea. You can save 25% on your annual subscription by visiting artsabox.com and using the code TBCTL25 at checkout. Again, that's TBCTL25 at artsabox.com.